everybody. Welcome to the G. Louise book series. I'm Christina, Kristina, and it's nice to meet you. And how are you? I'm fine. How are you? How are you? We having a good day? We having a good day? We're having a good day? Question? Welcome to the G. Louise book series. Please hit the like and subscribe. We just read books and talk about books. No special effects going on here. I could use all the subscribers and likes I can get. Those of you who already subscribed, thank you. Most appreciative. I haven't hit 200 yet as of this taping, and I'm wondering if I will ever hit 200. I've been trying to hit 200 for well over a year now, and it doesn't seem to be going anyplace. We've hit 170 about last September, and as you can see, I haven't gotten very far. So we'll see what happens. But please check out Flashback Mondays. We talk about Romantic Time Book Review Magazine, and Star Trek Fridays because I'm a series person. I like series. And my new series, If Then. If you like this author, then maybe you'll like that author. So what's up with you tonight, mister? This is my old co-host. I haven't seen him in a while since we lost my baby boy. We lost the old man. So anyways, today we are talking about the third book in my Victoria Thompson series, the Gaslight series, Sarah Brandt and Frank Malloy, Book 3, Murder on Gramercy Park. Now, we start the book off with Frank being a little upset. Frank is a detective sergeant with the New York City Police, or whatever it's called back then. And they've told him they want him to go investigate a possible suicide. It could be a murder, but they think it's a suicide because that's the way it was set up to look like a suicide. And when he gets there, now you know Sarah Brandt is a midwife, and her and Frank met 2 books ago on a case, and she's been helping him solve murders. And she's also helping him with his son Brian, who is deaf, and his mother, who is is a senior citizen. And so we have the kid's name is Brian, Brian, and that's his name. And so he's got a clubbed foot, and he's deaf, and Sarah's helping him with the kid too. Frank's mother, is not too pleased with the situation. She doesn't know the true extent. I don't think she knows the true extent of Sarah's family wealth, but we'll get there one day. We'll get there in a future books. But anyways, Frank gets called to the crime scene, and he comes in, and Mr. Edmund Blackwell has been murdered. And there is a gun. It looks like he committed suicide. But there are inconsistencies. The gun is too close. If he would have shot himself, it might have dropped or fallen on the floor. And it didn't. It's placed appropriately. The desk is neat. Everything's in its place. And the correspondence he was in the middle of writing is not finished. It's not signed. There's a lot of inconsistencies that stuff like that they can determine at this juncture. So, and then Frank learns that Mrs. Blackwell is pregnant. So he sends for Sarah Brandt to come help. And when he arrives, Mr. Amos Potter is Mr. Blackwell's assistant, a very eager assistant, and he offers Frank $500 to solve the crime. And then while Mrs. Brandt is examining Mrs. Blackwell, she determines that Mrs. Blackwell is addicted to opium. And because she's been taking the opium for a very extended period of time, when her child is born, the child is also addicted to opium. So the child is going to have problems. And I have got to blow my nose. Excuse me 1 second. So then Mr. Symington arrives in the commotion of all of this. And he is Mrs. Blackwell's father. And Sarah, and he is very protective of his daughter. He really highly liked Edmund. I guess he believed that Edmund was going to provide well for his daughter. And then Mrs. Blackwell is so, I do not like Mrs. Blackwell. Especially in the first few chapters, I do not like her at all. She gives birth to a child, and then she does not wish to breastfeed the child. She says that her husband wouldn't like it, and I believe that's her delirium due to the opium and stuff like that, but also because her husband was a little on the controlling side. But we later learned that he really didn't pay too much attention to her at all. He only used her for his demonstrations. Apparently, he was a bone setter, aka a prehistoric chiropractor. And he is using hands and setting bones and stuff like that. And apparently he cured Letitia, that's Mrs. Blackwell, of an ailment. She had fallen off her horse and was paralyzed for a short period of time. And Sarah probably believes he might have reset some bones, or given the length of time since the accident, that she might have just healed on her own. But everybody is convinced, totally convinced 100%, that Edmund solved her problem for her. And I think that's one of the reasons why the father liked Edmund so much. And because he believed that Edmund had money. So she doesn't even go to her husband's funeral. That's another reason I don't like her. Oh, and besides, I mentioned before that she didn't want to breastfeed the child, that she wanted to call for a wet nurse. But what really pissed me off even greater was that she didn't want to see the child. She didn't want to hold the child. And she did not want to name the child either. She's like, oh, I haven't even thought about it. Edmund insisted he was going to do it. And I'm like, this is your kid. You just gave birth to a miracle. I would kill to be able to do that. I would love to do that. But, for reasons God has just denied. But here's this woman, and she doesn't even want to hold the kid or name the, and I'm like, that was one of the biggest reasons why I didn't like this woman. And because she wouldn't get out of bed, she spent almost the entire book in bed. But I do have to tell you that during all of this, Calvin Brown shows up and he demands to see his father. And then the truth comes out that Edmund Blackwell was a fake name and that he was still married, and his name was Eddie Brown, and his family, his wife and kids, were living in Virginia. And Calvin had seen a poster of his father doing the hand thing and had come up to ask his father to give money to help support his mother. And so Calvin disturbs the balance of the situation, and they're trying to keep him a secret. And Mr. Potter, the assistant, tries to blame Calvin for the murder, but Calvin wasn't even there that day. He's got good alibis. And why would he kill his father? Because if he killed his father, then there'd be no money for the family. And it's just. So Frank offers to put the kid up while he investigates the murder, and will pay a ticket as long as he stays in town a week to help with the investigation and to answer some questions. Then Frank will give him money for his train ticket back home. And Mrs. Ellsworth, and I'm gonna do a vid about her later. Mrs. Ellsworth is Sarah's neighbor, and I enjoy her. We all enjoy Mrs. Whistledown, and if you know who Mrs. Whistledown is, you are a Julia Quinn fan. But anyways, a quarter of an hour later, she reached Bank Street. This is Sarah. And she strolled toward her front steps. She saw her elderly next-door neighbor, Mrs. Ellsworth, come out with her broom and begin to sweep. No dirt ever had a chance to collect on Mrs. Ellsworth's front steps because she was out there 10 times a day sweeping. She used this activity as an excuse to encounter everyone who passed by. Sarah wondered when she had a chance to do her inside work, since she always seemed to be watching out her front window for any activity that required her attention in the neighborhood. "Hello, Mrs. Brandt." "How are you today, Mrs. Ellsworth?" Sarah replied. Since Mrs. Ellsworth had once saved her life, Sarah would indulge her whenever she could. "Oh, I'm feeling quite cheerful, Mrs. Brandt. My apron fell off this morning, and that gave me quite a laugh." This didn't seem particularly funny to Sarah, but she knew Mrs. Ellsworth well enough to know there must be some hidden meaning in this event. Mrs. Ellsworth found hidden meaning in just about everything that happened. "Why did you find this so funny?" "Because when an apron falls off, it means the wearer is going to have a baby within the year." Even Sarah had to laugh at this too. Mrs. Ellsworth was in no danger of having a baby this or any year. "Perhaps someone is going to leave one on your doorstep," she suggested. And there she goes. Every single video I do, regardless of the time of day, she goes off. So it's 3. She only did 3. Wow, that's impressive. The last 2 videos she's done 12. And she never did 12 before. She always stopped at 9. You want to see who she is? Check out my New Year's Eve video. And that was Janet Ivanovich. Let's see. Has your son? Oh, or maybe it means you're going to be a grandmother. Sarah thought, teasing her. "Has your son been keeping company with anyone special lately?" "Lord, no," Mrs. Ellsworth said. "All Nelson does is work at the bank day and night. I tell him it's making him old before his time. But does he listen? Of course not. He tells me he needs to get ahead. I tell him he needs to get a wife. I want some grandchildren to spoil before I die. I don't blame you, but sooner or later he'll meet a nice girl and fall in love. Don't give up hope. And where have you been this lovely day? Delivering someone else's grandchild?" "No, I was visiting one of my patients." And she asked Mrs. Ellsworth if she had heard about Edmund Blackwell. And she said yes. "He's getting quite famous. I went to one of his lectures. Nelson always tells me I'm a fool for believing these charlatans. But how do you know that one of them might not have really discovered something that might help cure people?" "What did you think of him?" Sarah asked. "A lovely man," she said. "Quite handsome and tall. His voice was like velvet. Just looking at him made me feel better. So I imagine his treatments are quite effective." And then she says, "I'm not the only one who noticed either. As you can imagine, ladies tend to get sick more frequently if the doctor is handsome and charming. So Mr. Blackwell was in great demand. So I even heard, well, that's of no matter. And she's like, what? And she's like, um, that he uh, that he sometimes seduced his patients. So he was providing extracurricular activity in the bedroom for his patients for money. Go figure. So later on, Sarah goes to check on the Blackwell baby and checks on Mrs. Blackwell, and she still hasn't named the kid. Frank goes to the funeral, talks with Amos Potter. Calvin also attends the funeral. Mr. Fitzgerald tells Mr. Potter it's revealed that Mr. Blackwell did not own the house that they are living in, and Mr. Fitzgerald is the owner of the house that they are living in. And Mr. Fitzgerald, because Mr. Blackwell was providing medical assistance for his wife, quote unquote, he was letting Mr. Blackwell live in the house rent free. Now he would like Mrs. Blackwell to move out so he can rent the house to someone who could start paying rent. And Amos did not know this, and he's a little upset, and he tries to talk the man down, telling him that Mrs. Blackwell just had a child. And apparently nobody knew that Mrs. Blackwell was with child because she was kept hidden for so much. And so then she talks with Mrs. Fitzgerald, and Mrs. Fitzgerald is like, well, why isn't Calvin staying with his father? So there's a little stuff going on there. And then Frank learns that Mr. Symington, Letitia's father, Mrs. Blackwell's father, knew about Calvin because he had gotten information from Mr. Symington, and he went to contact Mr. Symington. Apparently, Mr. Symington was trying to do some stuff to protect his daughter. And in the middle of this book, we get an update on Brian. Frank takes Sarah, Frank, and Brian go to see Dr. David Newton, and the man who's going to fix Brian's club foot. And Brian is about 3.5 years old, and the doctor explains what he will do. And he tells Frank he does not need payment until the surgery has been completed. And then Sarah and Frank enjoy a pot roast and a Mrs. Ellsworth's pie. And then we have another Mrs. Ellsworth moment, and I love Mrs. Ellsworth's moments. And I think I'm going to do a vid later on the line. When she turned down Bank Street, she could see Mrs. Ellsworth sweeping her front stoop. She called out a greeting when she was close enough, and Mrs. Ellsworth pretended to be surprised to see her. Hello, Mrs. Brandt. Have you been delivering a baby? Not today, Sarah said. That's good, she said, as Sarah stopped beside her porch. I dropped my scissors this morning, and they landed point down and stuck in the floor. That's too bad, Sarah said. I hope it didn't leave a bad mark. Oh my, that's the least of it. Don't you know that when scissors stick in the floor, it's an omen of death? Dear me, the last time I had an omen like that, some poor girl you knew died. Sarah remembered and shivered. I'm sure it was just a coincidence, she said, as much to convince herself as to reassure Mrs. Ellsworth. In a city this size, people die every day, you know. That's true, of course, Mrs. Ellsworth agreed, and I'm always happy to be wrong about something like that. Are you and Mr. Boley working on another case? She said, yes, we are. And that he enjoyed Mrs. Ellsworth's pie. And she also says that Frank has started to look into her husband's murder. So that's good news for Sarah, too. She's very happy that Frank is doing this for her. And that's going to lead to some interesting developments down the road. So then Malloy talks to Amos Potter again. And then he goes to talk to Calvin. He wants to talk to him. He has a few questions. And when he gets there, he discovers that Calvin has been murdered with arsenic poisoning. And the clicker is that there was a note confessing to his father's murder. However, Calvin had written his mom a note, and the landlady had not mailed it yet. And when they compared the note to his mom with the suicide note, you could tell that they were completely 100% written by different people. And so they discover all that the poor kid's been murdered. So now they have to tell his mom in Virginia, who's waiting for a few dollars from the father, that not only is the father dead, but the son's dead too. So that's not good. So then we discover that Mrs. Blackwell's been making daily trips to the opium den. And did I do that one again? No, we have another Mrs. Ellsworth, and I love these. So tired as she was, she made her way down Bank Street to her home the next afternoon. She had a difficult morning. "Hello, Mrs. Brandt," her neighbor Mrs. Ellsworth called as she came out onto her front porch. She was dressed for the street in her bonnet and gloves and carrying a shopping bag. "Looks like summer is trying to come back. How are you this fine day?" "Better now that 2 little boys have made it safely into the world," Sarah replied. "Twins?" Mrs. Ellsworth asked, wrinkled her face, brightening. "Yes. One was Beach. I was afraid for a while he wasn't going to make it. Oh my, twins are so dangerous. I had a friend once who lost both of them. The cords got tangled or something." Sarah nodded. She'd seen her share of tragedies. "These are fine now, though, and their mother, too. I wager she's hoping now that these will be her last," Mrs. Ellsworth predicted with a smile. Sarah thought she was probably right, although tragedy was that women couldn't make such choice for themselves. The secrets of preventing pregnancy were passed around in guilty whispers, but anyone who tried to teach modern methods was subject to fines and even arrest. "I did want to warn you, Mrs. Ellsworth," distracting Sarah from her unpleasant thoughts. "I found some mouse droppings in the pantry this morning, and a mouse had been nibbling at my flour bag. You know what that means." "That the mouse was hungry?" Sarah guessed. Mrs. Ellsworth shook her head despairingly that she would ever teach Sarah anything at all about the mysteries of life. "It means something evil is going to happen. Nibbling the flour bag means that." Sarah felt reasonably certain something evil was happening at any moment of the day in a city the size of New York, but she didn't want to be unkind to Mrs. Ellsworth. "The mouse droppings just mean that we have mice, of course," Mrs. Ellsworth went on. "I set some traps, and you'd best do the same. Then may go over to your place, too." I just love Mrs. Ellsworth. So, we've got Edmund Blackwell has been murdered. His real name is Eddie Brown. He has a wife and family in Virginia who are depending on income from him. His son shows up asking for the income for the mom. And not only is Edmund dead, but then the son is killed. And then Letitia, Mrs. Blackwell's real lover, the one that her father's been working so hard to, that's the whole reason she's married to Mr. Blackwell, because she was running away with Dudley when she fell and injured and got the paralyzation. And trying to prevent the marriage, Mr. Symington, had Mr. Dudley fired from his school teaching job because he did not want his daughter to marry Dudley. He wasn't good enough for her. So apparently through all of this, because Edmund has not been paying to his wife at all, and his wife is with child, it's Dudley's child. And when the child is born with a full head of red hair, Dudley has a full head of red hair, you start to think. So Dudley, someone attempts to murder Dudley. So Edmund is dead, Calvin is dead, someone attempts to murder Dudley. There's another one, there's attempts something is going on. Do we have one killer? Is someone trying to kill all these people? Or do we have two killers? There's a surprise twisty at the end, and it'll be interesting. And I hope you enjoy it as we move on to book 4 in our series. So that was Victoria Thompson's Murder on Gramercy Park. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you will continue with me on this journey with Sarah Brandt and Frank Malloy as they continue to solve murder mysteries each book. Thank you so much. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Star Trek Fridays, Flashback Mondays, and If Then Fridays. I'm working really hard on those. I've got several planned. Thank you.